I'm Susan, and this is why I quilt. And then if somebody was a bad quilter, they'd wait till they were gone, and then they'd take all the stitches out, and then let them come back the next week and quilt. Originally, I'm from Northeast Kansas, and spent 30 years in Minnesota, and we came back here in 2012. 30 years in the Northland. I made my first quilt in 1981 when my daughter was born. I called my great aunt and said I wanted to make a quilt, and she brought all the little clippings you've maybe seen from the Kansas City Star, and they were in little plastic bags. They were my grandmother's, and we went through and found what we were going to make, and you had the measurements for one block, and then you had to figure out if you were going to do 12 blocks, how many 2.5 by 5 inch strips you needed, and you would figure out exactly how much fabric you needed. There was nothing that said, oh, for a baby quilt you need a half yard. You know, there was no measuring on them, so you just had the actual pattern with the pieces and how much you needed, and then you had to double or multiply it by how many blocks you were going to make. So we didn't have rotary cutters in '81. We didn't have rotary mats. We made patterns out of construction paper, and you cut them, and I always imagined they got smaller with each piece that you cut. But yeah, or some people use cereal boxes if they wanted something a little bit stiffer. I don't know when rotary cutters came out, but when they first came out, we really didn't know what to do with them.
Really?
Yeah.
Just a new learning curve.
It was just, you bought them because they were new, but you know, they didn't have big mats or anything, so. I actually have earlier memories. So I grew up in a little Lutheran church in Northeast Kansas, and we had a quilting group that got together weekly. And sometimes they'd be at our house. And my sister and I would sit under the quilting frames and listen to the ladies gossip all afternoon. And then one of the things that upset my mother is she'd serve a lunch, and then my sister and I would go and empty all the coffee cups, drinking all the coffee that was left over in the kitchen. But those are my first memories of quilting. And everybody I knew hand quilted, you know. So that was done instead of machine quilting that we do now. They'd put them up on a big frame, and then the frames would be raised up to the ceiling, or they'd have to take the whole quilt down and then the next week put it all back up again. Some people had it, like in their church, they would have a way they could pull it up. But in a home, we had, there were wooden pieces that you put the quilt in that went around, and you tied them to chairs, and then you would sit and hand quilt, and then they would take it down.
That's cool.
Yeah, that's prior to machine quilting, so that was machine quilting was pretty revolutionary.
Well, I'd say so.
Yeah,
yeah,
yeah, because everything was done by hand before. And then if somebody was a bad quilter, they'd wait till they were gone, and then they'd take all the stitches out, and then let them come back the next week and quilt. I would say so, yeah. It was just like 10 blocks, and, well, I guess it was 12 blocks. And I made it for my daughter. And it would, it had some applique on it, some basic applique. And just, you know, I was just learning, because that was my first, although I was in 4-H and I took home ec in high school. So I had a lot of sewing experience as far as clothing goes, but not quilting.
Does your daughter still have that quilt?
You know, I was thinking about that the other day. I'm not really sure if she does or not. I remember that the binding came off of it, wore off of it, because I didn't do it bias, and bias binding lasts twice as long, and nobody told me that. So of course, with all the machine washing and everything, the binding came off the edges. I think she probably has it or part of it. Yeah, I often think, I wonder what my grandmother was a major quilter, and I often think, I wonder what she would think about people who come here to Missouri Star and go into a store and actually buy all the fabric they need for a quilt. Because I don't think the only thing I ever remember her buying was muslin to put on the back of the quilts. Otherwise, everything was our clothing she had made, pieces she had left over. She would have never gone out and just bought fabric to make a quilt. People just didn't do that. You know, quilts were very utilitarian, and you needed them to stay warm, and people would just use what they had to make them. because I had a shop and I used to think that, what would she think if she knew people actually come in and just buy what they need to make a quilt? That would be so interesting.
That would be wild.
Yeah,
Probably.
it would be. It would be.
Did she teach you how to quilt?
No.
Who taught you how to quilt?
Her sister. So my grandmother and her sister were major quilters. My grandmother did just extraordinary applique quilts. And then my great aunt was also quilting. So my grandmother died when I was really young. I was just 7. And so when I wanted to make a quilt, I called my great aunt. And then she's the one who brought the little Kansas City Star clippings in plastic bags, and we went through it and figured out what we were going to do. My daughter has made some quilts, but I haven't really gone beyond that. But I would love to teach a class or teach young people how to quilt. We just did that recently, like I told you, and it was so, they were so excited to complete a project, and that was really fun to see.
That success.
Yes, yeah, yeah. Oh yes, always. So I'm just finishing up a top. I decided to piece a back for it, so that has taken longer than the top because I had instructions for the top. The back I'm just making up, but it's a sample for the retreat center. So I do 4 of those a year, and I've done 3 king size, because we have a king size bed now for the first time in our lives, and I have nothing to put on it that fits. So I'm just finishing up my 3rd king size quilt. So
How big is a king size?
this one is 116 by 118 or 120. I actually made it. It's a square, but I made it a little bit longer because I don't like a square quilt.
That's big.
Yeah, that's huge.
Do you know how many pieces that quilt has?
Oh, no idea.
What was the top?
The top is a basic, they're 5-inch terms, and they're put in 16 patches. So they're 4 by 4, and there were 4 in a row, 4 rows, 16 of those blocks. And they're good size. They're like 20-inch blocks.
Oh, wow. Oh, so nice.
Yeah, so that was nice. And then I made extra blocks and put those on the back. So,
Nice.
and then I put all the extra fabric on the back because I found that when I cut a quilt and I have leftovers, my tendency is that I put them in a tub and I never go visit that country again. Maybe a weekend visit, but they're kind of gone out of my life, and so I've started taking all that fabric and putting it on the back of the quilts. I just enjoy it, and now I'm kind of beyond making them for the family because the family has them, and I have a huge quilt closet, and they know anytime they come they can take one and go home. But I just recently did my first Quilts of Valor. They make quilts for soldiers, veterans. And, you know, their goal is that every veteran have a quilt. And I was at a ceremony at the Paducah Quilt Show, and it was so touching. And I started thinking about my brother, who's was in the Navy and retired Navy, and so I went over to one of the ladies and I said, "Could I make a Quilt of Valor and have it presented?" And she said, "Well, sure." So I made a quilt for my brother, and then that'll be presented to him in May, I think. But it was really fun, and I think, you know, it means so much to the veterans. It really does. So, because I saw the ceremony, and there were probably a dozen of them that received quilts, and they were in tears, and just very touching with their families, and just a real sweet, sweet gift. I used to keep everything, but now, you know, now if anybody likes it or wants it, and sometimes I make quilts specifically for people. I just gave each of my kids, I have 3 children, and I gave them all quilts at Christmas time, Christmas quilts, because I hadn't done that before, so they all have a Christmas quilt now. Binding.
Binding?
I bind by credit card. I have a binder. You know, I learned a long time ago, because people would tell me, you know, that they don't like to machine quilt. They don't want to try to run that whole quilt under their machine. And I'd say, well, you need to get a machine quilter. And I know machine quilters who don't like to piece, so they actually machine quilt for someone who pieces for them. So I thought, why am I not using my quilts? It's because they don't have binding, and I don't like putting binding on. So I actually hired a former employee of Missouri Star who retired, and she is my binder lady. I just took 2 quilts there on Friday. So it's an amazing thing. She's very good. Because if there's always some part you don't like of something, and why suffer through it? And she loves it. She loves it. In fact, she'll call me sometimes and say, "Don't you have any quilts for me?" So it's fun. It's fun. Probably acquiring fabric and patterns. That's probably even more favorite than you know, planning out the quilts and everything. I love doing that. Probably more than even piecing.
Is there an aspect of the quilting community that's your favorite? Because you work at the retreat center.
Yes.
Is that a point of joy when you?
Oh, I love. Yes, I love. I've done retreats since the 90s, but the late 90s. But I have a retreat up at Lake Okoboji in northern Iowa. I've done 2 a year there since 2000. I do one in the fall and one in the spring. And then I started working at Missouri Star in 2000. I did my first retreat here in 2014. So I've been here ever since. So we have 40 ladies a week, or up to 40 ladies a week. We do about 80 retreats a year between the week-long retreats and the weekends. So most Fridays and Mondays we have a turnaround day, we call it. So ladies leave at 11 on Friday, a new group comes in at 4. They leave Monday at 11, a new group comes in at 4. They leave Friday at 11. So that's my life. Yep. And then Misty, Jenny, and Natalie all teach there. So they're there the whole week. So there's no other retreat that happens at. So
Cool.
yeah, it's really great.
Cool.
And they're all good teachers, so that makes it really fun too. That's really a hard question. I mean, I quilt because I just love it. I love the craft. I love the planning. I love sewing it together. I love getting the finished project. I love giving it away. I love teaching. So it's kind of a combination of all of those things, I would say.
It's become a part of your life.
It is a part of my life. It is, yeah. And I know that once I do retire, I know that that's what I'll do every day is sew. At least a little bit every day.